All right. We are on chapter 4 of Ezra. And in chapter 3, they had begun the work on the temple. And so this is where we are picking it up today on chapter 4. So verses 1 through 4. And when the adversaries of Judah and Benjamin heard that the children of the captivity started to build the temple of the Lord unto the Lord God of Israel, they came to Zerubbabel and to the chief of the fathers, and they said, Let us build with you, for we seek your God as you do, and we do sacrifice unto him since the days of Esarhaddon, the king of Ashur, who brought us up hither. But Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the rest of the chief of the fathers of Israel said unto them, You don't have anything to do with us to build a house unto our God, but we ourselves together will build unto the Lord God of Israel, as King Cyrus, the king of Persia, has commanded us. And then the people of the land, that's the land of Israel, that was Israel, weakened the hands of the people of Judah and troubled them in building. So now when the northern kingdom was destroyed by Assyria, the Assyrian king took the people of the northern kingdom and they scattered them all through the world, they said. And they had brought other people into that land that they had conquered, and they had settled them there in the land of the northern kingdom. And it became known as Samaria. But that was the name of the capital city. But the land was also called that. And the people ultimately became known as the Samaritans. And when they came into the land, the wild animals began to turn against the people, and many of them were devoured. So they came to the king at that time, and they said unto him, We can't get along with the gods of the land. The animals are turning against us, so send us some priests that they may teach us how to worship in order that we might worship these gods of the land, so that these wild animals won't be eating our kids and all that. This is all from Kings. This is not in this part of the scripture, but it pertains to it. So the king of Assyria found some priests, and they brought them to these people, who the priests taught them to worship, the worship of God. But they feared Jehovah. But they also worshiped their own gods. So they mixed the two, the worship of Jehovah plus their own idolatry. And in other words, he was just made a part of their whole program of worship. But it wasn't a true worship of Jehovah, nor were there any descendants of Abraham or Israel. And they had a part of the total worship. They worshiped Jehovah even as they were taught. They did have sacrifices. They had been taught to have the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, all of those types of things. And they did that. So when these fellows came and were going to build the temple, they said, Well, we want to help you build the temple because we worship your God too. So Zerubbabel and Jeshua and the chief men decided that they didn't want their help. So let me tell you a little bit more about the Samaritans. They occupied this country that was formerly Israel, and it was really in the tribe of Ephraim and the half tribe of Manasseh where they settled. That included Samaria. So when the 10 tribes were carried away to Assyria, then the king of Assyria at that time sent men and women in there to take over that land. And these foreigners intermarried with what few Israelites were left in the land, and they inhabited Samaria. Now, they were instructed by the books of Moses. The priests had come down to instruct them in that, and they still remained idolatrous in their other worship. So they embraced a religion that was a mixture of Judaism and idolatry. Now, because they had intermarried with foreigners and adopted their own religion, they were despised by the Jews. So here's some other reasons, 4 other reasons why they were despised by the Jews. 1, after the Jews returned from Babylon, and then they began rebuilding the temple, while Nehemiah was engaged in actually building the walls of Jerusalem, they vigorously protested to halt the undertaking. They wanted to stop it. Number 2, the Samaritans built a temple for themselves on Mount Gerizim, which is where they thought that Moses said the temple should be built. And so Manasseh, the high priest, was there, and he had this idolatrous religion of the Samaritans, and it just became perpetuated here. The third thing was that Samaria became a place of refuge for all the outlaws of Judah. So anybody that was in Judah that was an outlaw, they could go to Samaria, and they would welcome them with open arms. These were the violators of the Jewish laws, the criminals, the ones who were refugees from justice, and those who had been excommunicated from Judah. So there was increasing hatred then between these two groups. Number 4, the Samaritans received only the 5 books of Moses. They disregarded any of the other writings in the Old Testament. So because of all these things, they were irreconcilable differences between the two groups. And so there was this hatred. The Jews regarded the Samaritans as the worst of the worst, and they had no dealings with them. But we remember that Jesus spoke, and he broke down the barriers between the Jews and the Samaritans, and he preached the gospel of peace to the Samaritans. And then, of course, the apostles followed after he had done that teaching. So these are the same people that at the time of Christ were called the Samaritans. So this was from all that time. And the Jews wouldn't have any dealings with them. It had been 400 years since they had formed the country of Samaria. And yet, let me show you this map. This is a map of Israel, of this part, what was Israel, and then Judah down here. But there were Jews here living in Samaria, or up here above Samaria, actually, in Galilee. And they were ordered to go down to Jerusalem down here to worship. So what they would do is they would go down the River Jordan by that and go through. They would not go through the main route through Samaria because they didn't want to have anything to do with the Samaritans. The story in the New Testament where they went right by the Samaritan who was injured by the right side of the road. Nothing to do with them. At the present time, I thought this was interesting, there are about 200 Samaritans still living. They're almost extinct. They live in the area of Nablus, which is right here. I have this little pink thing. Right here is Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal, and they're right there in between the two places. That's where they are living. And they still today have their annual Passover sacrifice. They go up to Mount Gerizim and sacrifice a lamb every year. They won't marry outside of their culture unless it's absolutely necessary. And because of that, they've had some issues with genetics. And to keep their community alive now, they go internet, they have mail order brides, they have other ways that they get brides now for the men there. And that is somewhat allowed because of but they do genetic testing now. There's a leader there that says they can marry anyone in the Samaritan community. Outside, no, it's impossible. If they wanted to marry a non-Samaritan, they would try to dissuade them. And if they did do that, then their inheritance was cut from them.
Did they cast them out of Samaria?
Yes.
They just cut their inheritance.
So the ones that they married had to become the Samaritans.
Okay.
Now Smith, who was one of the commentators, says that many of them were, he calls them idiots or imbeciles because of the genes mixing, and it didn't work right, the intermarriage.
Yeah.
So he said they were just not.
Intellectually disabled.
Yes. So their help being unwanted, they then turned against the Jews at Jerusalem. And they did their best to keep them from rebuilding the city. So they started really harassing them and hindering them. Now, this section in chapter 4, starting at verse 4 and going through verse 23, it's a section that is just put in there, and it talks about the Samaritans and how they tried to keep them to build the temple and to build Jerusalem. If you go from chapter 4, 1 through 3, and then skip over to 24, the rest of the chapter, it is a flow. But here, this is just stuck here in this middle, talking about it. Let's see. Verse 5. And they hired counselors against them to frustrate their purpose all the days of Cyrus, king of Persia, even until the reign of Darius, king of Persia. If they couldn't attack the work through a subversive partnership, then they would attack the work by discouraging the workers, troubling the builders, lobbying against them to the King Cyrus court. And to discourage them means really just to weaken their hands so that they couldn't do what they wanted to do. Verse 6 and 7, in the reign of Ahasuerus, in the beginning of his reign, wrote they unto him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Artaxerxes wrote Bishlam, Mithridath, Tabeel, and the rest of their companions unto Artaxerxes, king of Persia. And the writing of the letter was written in the Syrian tongue and interpreted in the Syrian tongue. Now, there are two other kings described in this chapter, Ahasuerus, who was also Xerxes, and he reigned between 485 and 465 BC, and then Artaxerxes the first, who reigned between 464 and 424 BC. So even after the temple was finished under Zerubbabel, the Samaritans continued to oppose the work of rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. And this ongoing resistance is chronicled in this section verses 4 through 23. So in the reign of Ahasuerus, king of Persia, at the beginning of his reign, they wrote to him an accusation against the inhabitants of Judah and Jerusalem. And in the days of Ahasuerus, Artaxerxes, who is the same name, Ahasuerus, they wrote him a letter in the Syrian tongue. Now, Ahasuerus is the one who we know of in the book of Esther. He was the king there. Okay, verses 8 through 16. Rum, the commander, and Shimshai, the scribe, wrote a letter against Jerusalem to King Artaxerxes, the king, in this sort. They then wrote Rum, the chancellor, and Shimshai, the scribe, and the rest of their companions, the Denites, the Aphrasaphites. These are big words. Yeah, the Tarphalites, the Aphathites, the Archavites, the Babylonians, the Susanthites,
The Debianites.
the Decavites, and the Elamites, and the rest of the nations whom the great and noble Asnapper brought over and set in the cities of Samaria, and the rest are on this side of the river and at such a time. Now, I looked up all these ites.
Oh, I like that. Okay, so tell us about
Well, good for you.
The Dinaites was the name of the Cuthenian colonists. You know, they went to 4 different cities. The Cuthan was one of them. And so these were the people from there. The Ephrathites was a tribe that would lived in Samaria. They opposed the building of the temple, and they don't know really where those people came from. They never have done that.
They're aliens.
Yeah. The Tarpolites, they were colonists placed in Samaria from Tapyri, T-A-P-Y-R-I, Tapyri. It was a tribe of Elamaeus. And then we have the Ephrathites, who have been thought to be the same as the ones before, but they're not. They are a different group of people. They're from the Aramaic and the Persian countries. Archavites, one of the tribes which Osnapper transplanted to swell the number of people in Samaria. They were the inhabitants of Ekrik, one of the 4 cities originally founded by Nimrod in Babylon. Then we have the Sugankites, the inhabitants of Shushan, who joined to keep them from building the temple. Then we have the Dahavites, which were villagers, which Osnapper sent to repopulate, and they were probably Persians from the Caspian Sea and the Sea of Esoph. Then the Elamites were listed among the people settled in Samaria by the Assyrians. They go back to Elam, who was the son of Shem. So that is kind of who these people are. Okay, this is a copy of the letter that they sent to him. Even unto King Artaxerxes, thy servants, the men on this side of the river. Now they're talking about the Euphrates River, which runs along Babylon. And so forth. Let it be known to the king that the Jews who came up from you have come to us at Jerusalem, and are building the rebellious and evil city, and are finishing its walls and repairing the foundations. Now let it be known to the king that if this city is built and the walls completed, they will not pay tax, tribute, or custom, and the king's treasury will be diminished. Now, because we receive support from the palace, it is not proper for us to see the king's dishonor. Therefore, we have sent and informed the king that search may be made in the book of the records of your fathers, and you will find in the book of the records and know that this city is a rebellious city, harmful to kings and provinces, and that they have incited sedition within the city in former times, for which cause this city was destroyed. We inform the king that if this city is rebuilt and its walls are completed, the result will be that you will have no dominion beyond the river. So this indicates that the work that they complained against was not really the work against rebuilding the temple, but it was rebuilding the city of Jerusalem. So the walls and foundations are those of the city, and we can't get those as the same thing. But by the reign of Artaxerxes, the new temple had already been just about completed at that time. So in verse 13, it says they won't pay tax, they won't pay tribute, they won't pay custom. This was a lie, and it was a false accusation. What they did is they recalled the former sins of Jerusalem, because it was a rebellious and evil city, and that's why God had to do something about it. And so now we have the Jews who have returned, who were good people, had no evil about them, and were not rebellious. But they did call attention to Jerusalem's sinful past and argued that if this city is rebuilt, it's going to be the same way, and you will not have any dominion beyond the Euphrates River. I have another map here that shows, here is Jerusalem, over here is Babylon, and this river right here is the Euphrates. So he's saying, if you rebuild this city of Jerusalem, they're going to have all of this territory. You're not going to have any of it.
The devil has been busy.
Yes. Yes, very busy trying to keep anything happening down in the south. All right, verse 17 through 24. Then sent the king an answer unto Rum, the chancellor, and to Shimshai the scribe, and to the rest of their companions that dwell in Samaria, and unto the rest beyond the river, peace, and at such a time. The letter which you sent unto us hath been plainly read before me, and I have recommended and commanded that a search hath been made, and it is found that this city of old time hath made insurrection against kings, and that rebellion and sedition has been made therein. There have been mighty kings also over Jerusalem, which have ruled over all the countries beyond the river, and toll, tribute, and custom was paid to them. So give you now commandment to cause these men to cease, and that this city be not built, until another commandment shall be given from me. Take heed now that ye fail not to do this. Why should damage grow to hurt the kings? Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rum and his companions, they went with haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews, and made them cease by force and power. Then ceased the work of the house of the Lord, which is at Jerusalem. And it ceased until the year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia, which was 522 when he went into his kingship. So the Samaritan letter was to stop. It was a combination of truth and lies. And what the king looked at was the lies, or the truth that was there is that they once were an evil city. And so that is completely what he looked at. So both David and Solomon had their territory all the way to that Euphrates River. And so that's why they were concerned about it. So the letter to the Samaritans was successful. They stopped the work of building the walls of Jerusalem and the city of Jerusalem. Artaxerxes, the king of Persia, he was perhaps the most powerful man in the world at that time. And he commanded that the work stop. So all this work that the Samaritans had done was successful, and they stopped the building for 15 years. They were not able to do any work. So in verse 24, it picks back up the thread of verse 5. And so now, again, we're at the time of Zerubbabel. And, of course, the work didn't stop forever. You know, they thought they could stop it, but God wanted it done. And so when God wants it done, it's going to get done. It was just delayed for a while. All right, their only victory was to delay the work, not to defeat it. So what the people in Jerusalem did, they started fixing up their own houses, and they made them very nice. They had ceilings and all kinds of things in their houses, really fixing them, and they neglected the rest of the part. And it says the part of building the temple. Now remember, we've gone backwards to verse 3 from the end of verse 3. So if you read Haggai, he's crying out against the people. People, you have done your houses, you fixed them up, but the house of the Lord, you need to build that. You need to do that first instead of fixing up your own houses. He says, is it time for you, O Israel, to dwell in your sealed houses while the house of the Lord lies desolate? Behold, take a look at things, because you have sowed much, but you've gathered little. And that's in verse 4 through 6 of Haggai. Any questions about this chapter? And we're through with this one. Okay, chapter 5. verse 1 through 2. Then the prophet Haggai and Zechariah the son of Iddo, prophets, and prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God of Israel, who was over them. Verse 2, Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel and Jeshua the son of Jozadak rose up and began to build the house of God which is in Jerusalem, and the prophets of God were with them, helping them. So the words of Haggai inspired them to pick it back up and start building again, even though they did not have permission to do so. So the two prophets now have proclaimed their message, and at that time they were pretty depressed because here they thought they were going to get the buildings done, the temple done, and they had been stopped. Now, in Haggai 1, 2 through 10, we see what the people's attitude was. In verse 2, it says, "The time has not come, the time that the Lord's house should be built." So they're not saying that the house should not be built. They're just saying, well, it's not time, so we have an excuse to not do it. It's the timing. And I was thinking about us. In this, the whole thing, it talks about us, how things have come against us, how we've had to wait. And then some people say, well, it's not time to move. It's not time to do this. Well, Haggai says, yes, it is time. The prophet rebuked them with this in the verse 4 of Haggai. Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses, and the temple lies in ruins? So he's saying, you need to take care of the house of the Lord first, and then you take care of your own home. So it was priority. What was their priority? Was it to build the house of the Lord, or was it to build their own homes? So instead, they should have felt no rest until they got the house of the Lord and the city of Jerusalem built. Okay, then God spoke to the people through another prophet in Haggai 7 through 8, chapter 1. Consider your ways. Go up to the mountains and bring wood and build the temple that I may pleasure in it and be glorified. So God called them, get back to work. Go get some wood, get to work. So sometimes God's cause needs work that's supported by prayer and not work that is neglected because of some pretended spiritual service. So the people had allowed a delay beyond their control to become a delay of their own choosing. So some of Zechariah's prophecy is also recorded in the book of Zechariah. Haggai's prophecy was a direct encouragement to get to work. Zechariah's prophecy was the spiritual condition of the people at that time. And his name means the Lord remembers. So he was a prophet of restoration. And he wanted not only the temple and the city restored, but he wanted the people's lives, their spiritual lives, to be restored. So he called to encourage them in that. And he encouraged them, telling them that God had cared for them. And then by keeping the presence of the Messiah, he kept that at the forefront of their minds. So he warned them of the consequences of neglecting the Lord's work, and emphasized that God wants us to work through his people. So if we went just by Haggai, we'd say, okay, we've got to do all this building, we have to do all that. But then Zechariah added this, no, we also have to have God's interest in the lives and rebuilding the lives. So it was effective and helped the people to reorder their priorities and resume building the temple. Now, Darius came to the throne at this time. And when he came to the throne, it was a time of trouble for him and a time of conflict. And so even though the people in Jerusalem didn't have permission to build the temple or the city, they went ahead and did it because Darius was busy trying to get out his problems, and he didn't have time for this little town way on the other side of them. And so that's why they kept building. Verse 3 through 5. At the same time, Tattenai, the governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-boznai and their companions came to them and spoke thus to them: Who has commanded you to build this temple and finish this wall? Then accordingly, we told them the names of the men who were constructing this building. But the eye of their Lord was on the elders of the Jews, so they could not make them cease till a report could go to Darius. And then a written answer was returned concerning this matter. Now Tattenai was the man appointed by the king of Persia to govern the province of Judah. So he and his companions wanted to know, why are you building? You've been told to stop, and yet here you are building. He seemed to be more reasonable than the Samaritans, who opposed the work for 15 years. So in verse 4, it says, accordingly, we told them the names of the men. And this was recorded by Ezra to demonstrate that there was no hint of rebellion among the returned Jews. In no way were they trying to rebel against Persia or the authority of their king, but the eyes of their God was upon them, so that they could not make the work cease. And God's blessing was upon them. So they resumed under a response of the prophets. The prophet said, go ahead and work. You don't have the permission to, but go ahead and work. And it's kind of interesting because the work continued. Postal service was very slow, so they couldn't get an answer very quickly from Darius. Bureaucracy was there, and it meant that the work could continue for a while. And second, they could pray and trust God, that he would guide King Darius to give them a favorable decision and allow them to start working again by the law. So verse 6, this is a copy of the letter that Tattenai sent. The governor of the region beyond the river, and Shethar-boznai and his companions, the Persians who were in the region beyond the river, to Darius the king. Now, Tattenai not only sent a letter to Darius, he also preserved a letter and sent it to Ezra. Verse 7 through 17. They sent a letter to him in which was written thus: To Darius the king, all peace. Let it be known to the king that we went into the province of Judah, to the temple of the great God, which is being built with heavy stones, and timber is being laid in the walls, and this work goes on diligently and prospers in their hands. And then we asked these elders and spoke thus to them: Who commanded you to build this temple and to finish these walls? And we also asked them their names to inform you that we might write the names of the men who were chief among them. And thus they returned us an answer saying, We are the servants of God of heaven and earth, and we are rebuilding the temple that was built many years ago, which a great king of Israel built and completed. And because our fathers provoked the God of heaven to wrath, he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this temple and carried the people away to Babylon. However, now this is the king, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Babylon, King Cyrus issued a decree to build the house of God. Also, the gold and silver articles of the house of God, which Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple that was in Jerusalem and carried into the temple in Babylon, those King Cyrus brought to the temple from Babylon, and they were given to one named Sheshbazzar, whom he had made governor. And he said to them, Take these articles, go carry them to the temple site that is in Jerusalem, and that the house of God be rebuilt on its former side. Then the same Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation of the house of God, which is in Jerusalem. And from that time, even until now, it has been under construction, and it is not finished. So here we see they went back to the original records from King Cyrus and found that he did indeed say, you have my permission not only to build the temple, but that he gave back all the articles that had been taken from that temple. So now they could honestly resume their building. So now, therefore, if it seems good to the king, let a search be made in the king's treasure house, which is there in Babylon, whether it is so that a decree was issued by King Cyrus to build this house of God at Jerusalem. And let the king send us his pleasure concerning this matter. So in this letter, Tattenai seems to fairly recount the situation from his perspective. And without prejudice, he explains the matter to King Darius, and it is done. So in verse 8, when it talks about the heavy stones, it says, so that may have been troubling to the king there. Why are they building something with heavy stones? Is it a garrison? Is it a fortress? We don't want that. But the courses of timber at that time were built. What they would do is they would build partial heavy stones, and then they would put lumber, and then it would be another section of stones. The reason they did that is because they had earthquakes in that part of the world. And if it was an earthquake, that would keep it from destroying the places. I didn't know that, but
That's good information.
yeah, that was how they did that in the Near East. Now, Sheshbazzar came and laid the foundation. Now, remember we talked about, it was in the first or second chapter, was Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel the same man, or were they two different ones? Here it says Sheshbazzar laid the foundation. In another place it says Zerubbabel did it. So here they think, well, maybe they are the same person. We're not just real sure. And Tattenai used this name because it would be the name that would be in the records rather than the other name. So Tattenai asked King Darius to research the matter, to determine the rebuilding of the temple and Jerusalem. And this is the Darius who loved Daniel and sat with him for many, many times. If you have any questions and comments about this, this is the end of chapter 5.